For tonight, I've chosen as last time I mentioned we'd start on the buildings, you know, with the three-part series like I did on the history of the Scottish Rite in Oklahoma, Masonry in Oklahoma. And so got many people held their hands up saying that they had attended. I'd forgotten that you all. So I thought, well, there's too many people that have already heard that, so I scratched that. And so I decided to come up with, since this is a lot of publicity and going on right now about the Civil War, because this is the 150th anniversary in the Civil War and so forth. I thought I'd come up with a little. I've entitled it Albert Pike, Scottish Rite, and the Civil War. Albert Pike was born and raised in the Boston, Massachusetts area, but as a 40-year-old, we find him in Arkansas. Albert Pike became a master mason in 1850 at the age of 40 in Little Rock. 3 years later, in 1853, he became worshipful master of his lodge. He also became active during that time in the York Rite. By 1853, listen to this, he had already become high priest of the Royal Arch Masonry, and later he became the Grand High Priest. He had become illustrious master of the Council of Royal and Select Masters, and he had become the first eminent commander of Knights Templars, all in the course of 3 years. His intelligence and leadership skills were so obvious that he seemed to be elevated to positions of authority in almost every endeavor that he took on. Also, in this period of 1853, he became a 32nd Scottish Rite Mason. After he had already done all his York Rite work, he becomes the 32nd Scottish Rite Mason. He was able to find time, in addition to his masonry activities, to have a successful law practice and be involved in political activities in Arkansas during those days. Now, this is Pike immediately. Here he is, he's just had the degrees, just taken the degrees. Pike immediately recognizes that the Scottish Rite degrees were in bad shape and were in need of revision. The additions and deletions through the years had made them disjointed. He therefore embarked upon this task in 1854 and 1855 on his own. Here he has just become a new 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason, and he embarks on revising the rituals already. And then a little later, he was appointed to a committee to officially revise the degrees. Well, evidently, he was the committee. Upon completion of his work in 1857, he was awarded the honor of a 33rd degree and elected to the Supreme Council. With the resignation of Grand Commander Reverend John Henry Horn due to failing eyesight in 1859, Pike was elevated to that position. Now here's a guy who becomes a Master Mason in 1850 and then accepts the position of Sovereign Grand Commander 9 years later. This guy's got to be some kind of a genius. Evidently, this high position in the Scottish Rite really didn't mean as much as we look at it today, because the state of the Scottish Rite during this time was very delicate. In addition to the degree problems, these higher degrees were still not very well accepted by many of the members of the basic fraternity of the Blue Lodge. When Pike took over, there were 9 members of the Supreme Council. That's all that were set up to be. Some of these members viewed the position as strictly honorary, and attendance was spasmodic at the council meetings. This statement alone indicates to me that the Supreme Council had very little control back in those days. When Pike took over, there were, listen to this, there were no existing records, minutes, or documents of the first 58 years of Supreme Council activity. Can you imagine that? It seems that they were handwritten, and since they didn't really have a home or an office or headquarters like they have now, they were taken home by the Grand Treasurer and the Grand Secretary, and in the course of the years they get lost. And so anyway, he started with the 0. So as I read this history, I come to the conclusion, and now this is my opinion, that without the arrival of Albert Pike, these higher degrees, which we call Scottish Rite, would have eventually vanished and disappeared. In the Supreme Council meetings of 1859 and 1860, his first two meetings to preside, Pike increased the membership in the Supreme Council to 33 members. That's what we have right now. That's still, and he instituted the rule that if a member misses 2 unexcused meetings, his position becomes vacant. That rule is still effective in the Supreme Council of today. So let's see. He also made sure that the council's transactions were written, later printed, and distributed to all the Orients. These actions and a whole lot of other minor actions that were taken, there is no question that the session of 1860 was one of the most transforming moments in the annals of the Supreme Council. The Supreme Council met again in New Orleans in April 2nd of 1861. The Supreme Council, the Civil War appeared to be imminent, and in order to try to make the Scottish Rite appear to be neutral, Pike had renamed the council as follows: the Supreme Council for the Southern and Western United States and for the Confederate States of America. He was covering his bases both ways, regardless of who won, I guess. Anyway, a few days later, of course, you know the Civil War started. What was it, Don? When Fort Sumter?
1861. April 12th, 1861.
April 12th, okay. So this was April the 2nd. So just a short period of time after this meeting in New Orleans, the actual battle of the first battle started, the Civil War. This meeting in New Orleans was the last official activity of the Supreme Council until the cessation of national hostilities 4 years later. This horrible time in our nation's history split the very fabric of our nation. It changed a united people into a divided people. Families split, friends split, religious denominations split, and more men were wounded and killed than in any other war before or since. Included in the southern jurisdiction were states on both sides of the issue. The northern jurisdiction states were all a part of the northern cause. Albert Pike returned to Little Rock, and 3.5 weeks after the fall of Fort Sumter, Arkansas joined the Confederacy. Because of his previous legal work with the 5 civilized tribes across the border in Indian Territory, Pike was given the job of enlisting the Indians into the Southern cause. Pike felt that the issue of slavery was morally wrong, but he also knew that slavery was so ingrained in the Southern economy that it could not be abruptly ended. Amazingly, this was the same feeling of 2 other major players of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln and Robert E. Lee. But all had to take sides. Pike, an Arkansas citizen, chose the South and proceeded in successfully enlisting most of the tribes to the Confederacy. And as a side note, this was a crime and a shame, as it turned out in the end, for the Indians. And for Pike, it turned out poorly too. And for the Confederacy, it was not any better. So this action that they took, that he thought was going to help the Confederacy really in the long run, did. And I'll tell you why. Pike had previous military experience as a captain in an Arkansas regiment in the Mexican War. After his magnificent job with the Indians, he was commissioned a brigadier general with the Confederacy, which on the surface would appear like just another notch in his belt. Here he is, another organization. Here he is immediately hopping to the top, just like he has done in everything else. Another recognition of his leadership skills. However, it actually turned out to be a real problem in his future life. In as brief a manner as possible, let me give you a quick glance at Pike's brief military career in the Civil War. Each of the 5 tribes were to raise a regiment of men. Some did, and some didn't. They were ordered to join an army of Confederate troops and march into southern Missouri. Some did, and some didn't. This created the Battle of Pea Ridge. Pike was in charge of the Indian troops in this battle. This battle is sometimes referred to as the Gettysburg of the South. Most historians generally believe that this to be a little bit too strong a statement, but it was a very important engagement regarding the war. If the South could have taken southern Missouri and then moved into eastern Tennessee to help their comrades who were wrestling with General Grant's forces, they would not only have maintained control of the Mississippi River, but they would also perhaps had a chance to stop Grant. It was not to be. 2 of the Confederate generals in the Battle of Pea Ridge were killed early in the action. This left Albert Pike as the primary commander. The Indians performed poorly. They were not ready for the white man's warfare, and it resulted in a major defeat for the South. Some of the Indians resorted to their old form of warfare, and reporters on the scene made note of Indians scalping dead Union soldiers. When word of this atrocity was made public, General Pike was denounced by many northern newspapers and even a few of the southern papers. Headlines read things like this: "The meanest and most malevolent of the rebel leaders." Another called him a venomous reptile. Immediately upon hearing during the battle about this scalping deal, Pike issued a special order condemning this brutal behavior. He even sent a copy of it to the Union general, whose name was Curtis, under a flag of truce. Despite his issuance of basically an apology and the fact that he had no knowledge of the action until after the fact, and also that he certainly had not ordered this activity, he was never able to live down what became a source of frequent embarrassment, even bitterness, in his later life. Compounding the problem, the Union general, General Curtis, never made public Pike's gesture of condemnation and remorse. It was later revealed that just General Curtis was a fellow Mason. Thereafter, Pike's military career continued to be bumpy. He was continuously arguing and quarreling with his superiors, even to the point of close to a court-martial. These people were his superiors in rank, but probably were inferior to him in intelligence, which ultimately led to his resignation. His life as a general lasted less than a year. Less than a year. During the rest of the war, Pike bought a small farm in a rural area of Arkansas, and then he went back to work on the degree rituals and began the book of Morals and Dogma. Pike's Civil War experiences was not something to be proud of, one of the few failures during his lifetime. At the end of the war, Pike was left in legal limbo as he was excluded from the general amnesty granted to Confederate soldiers and officials. Probable causes was because of his securing the allegiance of the 5 civilized tribes and, of course, the scalping incidents. He was afraid he might be arrested and tried on war crime charges. He headed for Mexico, then changed his mind before he ever got there, and came back to Memphis and actually set up a law practice for a while in Memphis. While he was there, he petitioned Andrew Johnson and for a amnesty. And while awaiting an answer, he again became concerned about arrest and actually went to Canada for about 2 months. So he was kind of shook up. Finally, he received word that his petition for amnesty had been granted, providing that he take an oath of allegiance and conduct himself as a loyal citizen. This granted him again his citizenship plan. Well, what pops in my mind was, what were the members of the Scottish Rite, and particularly the Supreme Council, thinking when their Grand Commander was on the lam? This scenario only lasted, fortunately, about 6 months, and then he was back on the job as the Grand Commander. A Supreme Council meeting in Charleston in November of 1865, immediately after war, was called. During his allocution in that meeting, in his always formal writing style, he made the following statement: "At the close of that great pitiless reaper death, we assemble from states widely distant from each other, and not long since mad with all the direful passions of civil war, to kneel together once more around the altar of Scottish Rite Masonry, to lament the dead, and to labor for the benefit of society, our country, and humanity." Pike advised the council that all 32 degrees, 1st through the 32nd, had been revised and were ready for printing. Now you notice I said 1st through the 32nd. So that meant he had also either written or revised the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degrees. Now just again, as an aside, he did that from what this history that I read. He was not doing that to try to be anti to the Blue Lodge. It seems that during those days, certain segments of the York Rite, men could go immediately into the York Rite without going through the Blue Lodge. And so there was a lot of York Rite Masons that had no Blue Lodge experience, but then who wanted to come into the Scottish Rite Masonry. Well, to accommodate them, they had a 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degree, which Pike had adapted in his own way in words from the Blue Lodge degrees. And so we still have those. Of course, they're rarely used. Anyway, during the next few years, the different factions of the northern jurisdiction, now you can remember at the previous meeting when we talked about the 2 jurisdictions, how the northern jurisdiction was all messed up. They had 3 different factions up there, and they were always quarreling and competing, and they were at one another's side. Well, they finally got together and under one roof, and they in 1867 they had the Pact of what was called the Pact of 1867, and the 2 jurisdictions then finally formalized their relationship, and so that's when the southern jurisdiction recognized the northern jurisdiction, and ever since then we've had pretty good terms. During this time also, Pike moved his law office to Washington, D.C. And in 1870, the official office of the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction moved from Charleston to Washington, D.C., 1870. No official reason was ever listed in the minutes of the Supreme Council for this move. However, educated guesses are as follows. 1, that Charleston was still the center of Confederate hatred and had a stigma about it, plus the fact it was like the rest of the South going through Reconstruction days. 2, since D.C. was the nation's capital, the location would give the Rite more prestige. And 3, probably the main reason was Pike had decided that this was where he was going to live, and he wanted a day-to-day hands-on future management role in the future of the Scottish Rite. Now, again, another little aside, why did he move to Washington, D.C.? Was because he and his law firm wanted it to make it easier to try cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. And so that's what they did. But Pike found, I'm just throwing this in because Pike found that in his first 2 or 3 appearances before the U.S. Supreme Court, even with his ability to speak, his ability with words, his persuasiveness, he found that he was not doing well because the stigma of the Pea Ridge incidents was still with him. And so thereafter, he sent his other lawyers in the firm to do the speaking before the Supreme Council, and he did all the groundwork before they got there. So this thing followed him the rest of his life. Okay, this is the end. The first 11 years of the Pike regime, that's 1859 to 1870, were momentous for both the nation and for the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. In a later speech, a noted Scottish Rite scholar and a person who later became Grand Commander, James D. Richardson, referred to Albert Pike as the Moses of the Rite. He said that Pike had taken the Scottish Rite out of bondage of poverty and depressed morale. He said he had delivered a new law, was the leader of the exodus into a new land. He had crossed the Potomac, seeking a new day for the Rite. This is the story of Albert Pike, the southern jurisdiction, and the Civil War. Thank you.
All right.